In part 2 for chapter 7 lecture, we discussed all of the different cost functions associated with the firm's resources in the short run. And then from those cost functions, we know that we could then graph all of the different cost curves. Now what we're going to do is focus on the long run. In other words, if the firm is making a decision in terms of output for the long run, that means they are no longer dealing with fixed resources, so diminishing returns does not apply. In the long run, we often refer to that as the planning phase for the firm because that's when they can look at all combinations of resources and ultimately determine what combination of resources they want to have in the future to influence the level of output that they produce. So if we refer back to the original schedule that we looked at in the lecture 2, what we're seeing is that every single one of these combinations are now available to us in the long run. You'll recall in our previous example, we said in the short run the firm only had 10 airplanes, which means the only output combinations that we were looking at were all of the output combinations in this column right here, since we were making a short run decision. However, if we are in the planning phase for the firm, if we're looking to see how much output we want to produce in the future, that means every single one of these combinations are available to us. In other words, because we can acquire more fixed capital in the long run, so we can increase the number of planes that we have to 15, 20, 25, 30. So again, we can see why every single one of these output combinations is going to be available to us. So again, in the long run, we can decide how much capital resources we want to have, whereas in the short run, that was fixed. Now, when we refer to the firm increasing the amount of physical capital that it has, the term that economists use is scale. So you probably heard people refer to a firm either scaling up or scaling down. What that simply means is that they're increasing or decreasing the amount of physical capital that they have. So each one of these columns of data represents a scale, or basically a different size to the firm. In other words, as we acquire more physical capital, the size of the firm increases. So we would say that the firm is scaling up. So again, if we went from having 5 planes to 15 planes, the firm would be scaling up. We would be increasing the size of our firm. However, if we're decreasing the amount of physical capital that we have, that means we're scaling down. Therefore, if we had gone from having 25 planes down to 10 planes, then again, the size of the firm would be decreasing. So oftentimes you hear that reported a lot in the news. In other words, firms have, perhaps laid off people, closed down factories. That's because they're scaling down. They're decreasing the size of the firm, oftentimes in an attempt to bring costs down and to make them profitable again. So again, we just want to make sure that we understand that each one of these columns of data represents a different scale. So this would be a scale right here. This would be another scale right here, so on and so forth. And so as we increase the amount of physical capital that we have, we are scaling up the size of the firm. Another thing is that because each one of those columns of data represents a different size of the firm, each one of those columns of data comes with their own set of cost functions. So in other words, we could calculate average total cost, or if we have 5 planes, we would calculate average total cost if we have 10 planes, and so on and so forth. In other words, each size of the firm is going to have a different set of costs, which makes sense as to why in the long run we would be examining all of the different costs associated with the different level sizes of the firm. So you recall back to lecture 2, I said notice that there's different combinations of resources we can use that give us the same amount of output. So again, notice that if we have a scale of 10 planes, we can produce 360 passenger airline miles here. But if we scale up to 15 planes, we can also produce 360 passenger airline miles. So what we want to see is which one gives us the lowest cost. In other words, which one has the lowest average cost per unit if that was the level of output that we were trying to produce. So again, in the long run, that's why we're comparing all of the different output combinations, because we're trying to see which ones give us the lowest cost combination of resources. Now what we see on this particular slide is me graphing the short-run average total cost curves for each one of these columns of data. Remember I said that every single scale comes with its own set of cost functions. So if I wanted to put all of these short-run average total cost curves on the same graph, this is hypothetically what it would end up looking like. In other words, if I have 5 planes, I'd be looking at short-run average total cost curve 1. If I had 10 planes, I'd be looking at short-run average total cost curve 2. If I had 15 planes, short-run average total cost curve 3, and so on and so forth. So again, I can see that as I am changing the size of my firm, my average cost per units are changing. And so again, what I'm seeing is that I have a different set of cost functions for every size of the firm. And so if I'm in the long run planning phase for the firm, I can compare all of these different cost functions side by side to see which one ultimately gives me the lowest cost per unit. Now let's say the firm was hypothetically currently producing along short-run average total cost curve 3. In other words, that would be right here having 15 airplanes, and so that would be short-run average total cost curve, and let's say that I was producing at point A. So again, we see that at point A, my cost per unit, if I come across here, is going to be somewhere right there. Now, if I'm in the short run, I can only compare the output combinations within this column of data right here. In other words, I can decrease or increase the number of variable resources I have in order to alter my costs. However, notice that if I want to continue to produce the same amount of output, so notice that our output is right here at Q4, my firm can actually decrease its cost per unit by scaling up, because notice that along short run average total cost curve 4, which of course is if I have 20 planes, so now I'm along here, I can still produce Q4. However, instead of my costs being up at point A, my costs go down. In other words, I can decrease my cost there to point B. So in the long run, this firm would have an interest in scaling up, in other words, increasing the size of their firm by increasing the amount of physical capital that they have, because they can actually experience a decrease per unit cost while producing the same amount of output. So you can see why it makes sense in the long run that a firm wants to be able to compare all the different output combinations in relation to the costs so that they can find the least cost combination of resources to utilize for the level of output that they want to produce. Now, just like we can graph our short-run average total cost curves for the firm, we can also graph what's called our long-run average total cost curve for the firm. In other words, it makes sense that a firm is always going to want to produce using the least cost combination of resources, depending on the size of the firm. So to figure out what the long-run average total costs are going to be, we're simply going to connect the dots, basically, of the lowest cost combination of resources with each level of output. So in other words, we'd find the lowest cost combination along each one of those short-run average total cost curves and then basically just connect the dots. So notice that the long-run average total cost curve is just going to run below the minimum point of all of our short-run average total cost curves. So it basically has the same shape of the short-run average total cost curves. However, the short-run average total cost curves gets its shape from the diminishing marginal returns. Remember, we talked about that in lecture 2. Even though the long run average total cost curve has the same shape, it does not get its shape from diminishing marginal returns, because remember, diminishing marginal returns applies simply because we have fixed resources. In the long run, we don't have any fixed resources, so the reason the long run average total cost curve has that hump shape is for a different reason. When we are explaining the reason why the long-run average total cost curve has the shape that it does, we say that it gets its shape from both economies and diseconomies of scale. When we say that a firm is experiencing economies of scale, what is happening is that they are able to experience a decrease in their per unit costs as the quantity of production increases and all the resources are available. So since all the resources are available, that means that we're talking about the long run. And so economies of scale is going to represent the downward sloping portion of the long run average total cost curve. So again, going back to this graph and looking at our long run average total cost curve, notice that if I wanted to produce a quantity that was over here, well, I would be up here. That would be my cost per unit where I intersect my long run average total cost curve. So my cost per unit would be way up here. However, if I increase the size of my firm to this cost curve down here, so again, going from short run average total cost curve 1 to short run average total cost curve 4, which is the same thing as saying I'm scaling the size of my firm up. In other words, I'm increasing the amount of fixed capital. Notice that I increase the quantity of output that I'm producing because I go from here to here, and at the same time, my cost per unit goes down. It goes from way up there to down here. So in other words, anytime a firm is increasing the quantity of output that they're producing and they're experiencing a decrease in their cost per unit, that is called economies of scale. So firms like to experience economies of scale to be able to increase the amount of goods and services that they produce and do it at a lower cost per unit. Diseconomies of scale is going to be the opposite. That is going to increase the per unit costs as the quantity of production increases and all the resources are available. So that's going to represent the upward sloping of the long run average cost curve. So again, let's say this is what my long run average total cost curve looks like, and let's say I was currently producing a quantity of output right here. So in other words, here's the quantity of output, which means my cost per unit would be right here. And now let's say that the firm decides to increase the quantity of output they produce. So they want to produce Q2 way over here. Well, notice that when this occurs, we now intersect our long run average total cost curve up here. And so my cost per unit actually goes up. I'm paying more for each unit of output that I'm producing. So again, that would represent diseconomies of scale. If you're increasing the quantity of output that you're producing and your cost per unit is going up, then you're experiencing diseconomies of scale. Now, a firm can also experience something called constant returns to scale, and that's going to be at a level of output where they can actually increase or decrease the amount of output that they produce, and their cost per unit doesn't actually change. And so that's going to be at the bottom portion of the long run average total cost curve. So here, if we flatten out the bottom of our long run average total cost curve, it makes it easier for us to see how a firm can experience constant returns to scale. In other words, we notice that at any point of production between here and here, the firm does not experience any change in their cost per unit. In other words, their cost per unit stays exactly the same when they increase or decrease their quantity of output between those 2 points. So again, that's going to be where a firm experiences constant returns to scale. Whereas the portion of the long run average total cost curve that's over here, that represents economies of scale. And then when we start seeing our costs go back up over here, that's when a firm experiences diseconomies of scale. Now, most companies experience both economies and diseconomies of scale. In other words, as their cost per unit of production goes down as they increase output, then they're going to want to continue to increase the level of output that they're producing to continue to experience those economies of scale. However, many times they scale, too big, and their cost per unit actually starts to go back up, and then that signals to the firm that they need to scale back down. In other words, they want to bring their costs back down. So the textbook actually gives a really good example on this, where they talk about Mrs. Fields Cookies and how Mrs. Fields Cookies originally started out as a one-man show up in Northern California, and because the demand for these cookies was so great, they decided to expand, and so they actually moved their headquarters to Utah, and it then became a multi-person operation, and they started to process their cookies throughout most of the United States. And so when this happened, they were experiencing economies of scale. In other words, as they purchased larger machinery to produce their cookie dough, it enabled them to produce larger quantities in a shorter period of time at a lower cost. But then, as time went on, and the company continued to grow, the original CEO of the company wasn't able to keep track of everything all on their own. So they had to start hiring out more people. They started having more managers, more presidents, more executives to keep track of all of their operations. And so then, of course, what happened is they started to experience diseconomies of scale. In other words, all of those additional costs that the firm had to incur, started to make the firm have to pay more per unit, and eventually Mrs. Fields had to file bankruptcy, was dismantled and then completely reorganized. So again, most firms are going to experience both in the long run. Now, there's also something called a minimum efficient scale when we're looking at production for the firm in the long run. And the minimum efficient scale is simply going to be the size of the firm at which the long run average total cost curve reaches its minimum point. In other words, where the average total costs are the lowest. Or the cost per unit is the lowest. So in other words, if we look at this particular long run average total cost curve here, we see that the costs are lowest when we are at this scale right here at short run average total cost curve 5. So in other words, there's no other size to the firm that is going to give us a lower cost per unit than when we are right there at the short run average total cost curve 5. So again, to know what the firm's minimum efficient scale is, you have to be able to look at their long run average total cost curve and identify where their cost per unit is lowest. And of course, this is going to vary from industry to industry. The minimum efficient scale, can be significantly smaller, for instance, in the production of something like shoes opposed to something like cigarettes that is, produced on a much larger scale. So, where the minimum efficient scale is definitely going to vary from industry to industry. All right, so just so that we understand how this is going to affect the firm in terms of the planning phase in the long run, let's say that I gave you a problem that looked like this. So in other words, let's say the firm has 3 different sizes. They can either choose to have 1 factory, 2 factories, or 3 factories. So again, we see right here in my schedule of information the different numbers of factories that the firm is able to have, and then based on the number of factories they have, what the varying levels of output they can produce are based on the number of variable resources they acquire. And then what I've done is also graphed the short run average total cost curves, for the firm, depending on whether they have 1 factory, 2 factory, or 3 factories. So notice that they all kind of overlap each other. So in this case, it's not looking like the previous graph that we had done where all the short run average total cost curves were going in a perfect little U shape. Now let's say that the firm currently operated with 2 factories and they were producing 400 400 units of output. So again, that would mean that their cost per unit was right here because they have 2 factories and the quantity is 400. And we are now in the planning phase for the firm. We want to know whether or not they should scale up or scale down, and that they continue to want to produce 400 units of output. Well, again, we can see looking at these short run average total cost curves right here, when we examine at 400, where do we intersect them? We can clearly see that the green curve, when we have 3 factories, is going to have a higher cost per unit than if we stay at 2 factories. However, if we scale down to 1 factory, we see that the cost per unit for 1 factory at 400 units of output is actually lower. And then, of course, when we look at the data in the table, we see the same thing. In other words, if we're not looking at the graph, we can look at the schedule and just see at 400 units of output, our cost per unit is 120 if we have 1 factory, 160 if we scale up to 2 factories, and 180 if we scale up to 3 factories. So if this firm currently had 2 factories and we wanted to continue to produce 400 units of output, it would be in the best interest of this firm to actually scale down. In other words, shut down one of their factories and only produce with 1 factory, because their cost per unit would actually go down. So in other words, you want to be able to look at a schedule or a graph and be able to figure something like that out. Opposed to, let's say that the firm had 2 factories and they were currently producing 600 units of output. So now we're looking at this data right here, and we want to know whether they should scale up or scale down, where clearly we can see from not only looking at the schedule but also looking at the graph that our cost per unit is actually the same regardless of whether we have 1 factory, 2 factories, or 3 factories. So if the firm wanted to continue to produce 600 units of output, they wouldn't have any interest in scaling up or scaling down because their cost per unit would not change. Now, to wrap up this particular lecture, I want to reiterate the fact that the long run is referred to as the planning horizon, because that is when the firm gets to decide, what combination of resources that it wants to use, and and then they commit to that. Once a scale is picked, so once they decide the amount of physical capital they want to have, we would say the firm is now operating in the short run again. So again, the firm is going to evaluate the demand and production costs jointly and then select the scale that appears to be the most profitable for them. All right, so let's do a few review questions. Number 1, when a firm is making decisions about the use of fixed and variable resources, what is it doing? Is it making a decision for the short run or the long run? Well, we know anytime a firm has fixed resources, that means they're focusing on the short run. So the correct answer would be A, because in the long run, there are no fixed resources. Number 2, the U shape of the long run average total cost curve occurs when? Well, we know that it gets its U shape from the economies and diseconomies of scale. So examining all of these choices, we know that the correct answer is going to be B. We know that initially the firm is going to experience economies of scale. In other words, their cost per unit goes down as they increase production. Then they have a constant returns to scale, and then they will experience the diseconomies of scale. So remember, that's why the curve looks like this. You have costs going down, then they bottom out, then they go back up. So the correct answer would be B. Number 3, diseconomies of scale is what? So again, if we look at all of these different option or choices available to us, the only one that is correct would be E. In other words, it occurs when all resources are a variable. So that's in the long run, because in the short run, they're not all variable. And the unit costs increase as the quantity of production increases. So again, remember, we have our curve like this. And so if our costs are down here initially, and then we increase the quantity of output to go this direction, so we increase, our cost per unit goes up. That is diseconomies of scale. So the only correct answer would be E. And then number 4, true or false, the minimum efficient scale is the level of output where the short run average total cost curve reaches its minimum point. That would actually be false, because remember, the minimum efficient scale is not talking about the short run, it's talking about the long run average total cost curve. So in other words, if this question stated the minimum efficient scale is the level of output where the long run average total cost curve reaches its minimum point, that would be true.